Welcome to this fast-paced tour of the Canadian energy landscape, designed to prime you on the shape of the energy system that drives our economy and society. Today, we offer this immersion tour of Canada's energy landscape to build a fact-based fluency at a pivotal time. Our tour format is one that Andy and I have designed and delivered as part of our Energy Future series to global leadership audiences for several years, with the aim of inspiring informed discussion and greater understanding. Since launching our tours, we have increasingly considered replacing the descriptor transition, implying a conversion to a known destination, to evolution, which better captures the dynamics affecting global energy. Whether you see it as a transition or evolution, now is an important time to understand our energy base and these dynamics. So over the next 60 minutes, we will characterize the defining features of Canada's energy system. We'll survey the headlines shaping its context. We'll visit primary energy sources and consider the direction of travel for infrastructure and policy. So, fasten your seatbelts for this immersive tour.
Our tour today features the Canadian energy trilemma, its greenhouse gas emissions and energy demand, and then we will look at 11 features of the Canadian energy system: oil, hydro, coal, nuclear, gas and LNG exports, wind, solar, electricity storage, carbon capture, hydrogen, and finish with geothermal. We'll do 33 site visits and on our way also do some site trips. So Mary, please start our tour by looking at Canada's energy trilemma.
We start with Canada in the energy trilemma, and here the classic equilateral triangle frame of balancing security, equity, or our lens of affordability, and sustainability is skewed. Energy affordability and security are eroding, and sustainability goals remain unmet. As such, Canada's energy system today reflects a fraction of its true potential. Rising energy costs as part of broader affordability concerns led to the scrapping of the consumer carbon tax, amid Canada's historic energy economic advantage being under threat, choked by regulation. For a country reliant on energy exports to the U.S., recent U.S. tariff threats have ignited interest to diversify export markets via LNG and new pipelines. Energy security, once a national strength, is losing ground and complicated by deep concerns about Canada's clean energy regulations. Despite net zero legislated targets, there is no realistic prospect of reaching interim targets in 2030 or 2035, and there are growing concerns over impacts to grid reliability as well as affordability. Provinces such as Alberta and Saskatchewan criticize the federal sustainability-driven regulations as unworkable and even reckless, underlining interlocking tensions between energy affordability, reliability, sustainability, and environmental values. Let's start with a side trip to ground us in our position of primary energy supply, fueling and powering Canada. Here we see the ongoing significant role of oil at 32%, giving way to gas rising to 34% over time, and together accounting for 2/3 of primary energy and significant energy exports. Next in energy supply contribution is hydropower, which has distinguished Canada as a clean power leader globally, and yet which is currently stalled in potential contributions at 22%. After hydro, other primary energy supply comes from nuclear, holding at 5%, and with wind increasing, coal a sliver, rounding out at 3% and 2%, and biofuel and solar each contributing a modest 1%. Clouded in the picture for Canada as a whole is significant regional differences in primary energy supply contributions and economic advantage, which in turn are sources of friction on the energy policy front in supply and export contributions for oil, coal, and gas, and import vulnerabilities for solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries. Next, in side trip 2, let's look at our emissions across our economy on the curve of historical emissions. Here we see emissions rising from 1990.1 to inflection in 0.2 and downward to 0.3 today. Canada has bent the emissions curve and was tracking, if planned policies were enacted and sustained, to 0.4 in 2030 to be almost sufficient for nationally determined contributions. However, new tension associated with current actions and planned policies amid a drive to prioritize better economic outcomes, especially associated with trade and energy affordability, are triggering policy change momentum. The implication is the pathways are likely insufficient, and for Canada's lofty climate financing goal, highly insufficient to deliver the original NDC targets. Practically, almost all countries are struggling with their NDCs and needing to reconsider pathways given heightened economics and trade turmoil. Of note, for Canada, our land use and forestry have challenged us as both a source and a sink. Dropping down onto Canada's carbon taxes, we see a clouded landscape. With the consumer carbon tax abolished as of April 2025, the nationwide fuel charge was removed, ending direct carbon pricing on gas, diesel, and heating fuels for individuals. Yet, the industrial carbon pricing remains, with large emitters still subject to a carbon price on emissions above intensity benchmarks. Here, the carbon price is set at $95 currently per ton of CO2 equivalent. However, with carbon credits available at 1/3 of the stipulated price, and with no action yet to revise the scheduled price rise or refine the program with the Consumer Element Acts. There is much speculation on the future of carbon pricing and the program itself, as high carbon pricing is required to support, at the industrial level, new federal commitment to projects such as the oil sands pathways, and with Alberta vowing to cap the current price. Now, after looking at our carbon regime, we visit oil, which contributes 32% of Canada's primary energy and 1% of electricity. In the recent news headlines, we see an impetus to rebalance economic opportunity and climate accountability arising from tariff and trade vulnerabilities and shifting global alliances. We see that oil production continued a strong recovery to record highs per day despite lower prices, and driven by cost-cutting innovations such as autonomous mining and robotic maintenance, which have made Canada's oil sands among North America's lowest cost plays. We also see Mark Carney's grand bargain with industry featured in upstream carbon taxes and fast-tracked clean infrastructure promises, which aim to reconcile emissions goals with energy security and economic prosperity, yet with no real commitment to oil pipelines. Meanwhile, the Trans Mountain pipeline that was vastly delayed and over budget, mired in opposition, has started to reshape Canada's export landscape, with China overtaking the US as top buyer. So Andy, let's see these headlines on the ground and explore oil production in Canada and the potential for expanded production and export diversification.
Canada produces 5.3 million barrels of oil per day, mainly from what we can see at the yellow markers, the oil sands in Alberta, at Athabasca, Cold Lake, Peace River and Rainbow Lake, all onshore in Western Canada, and unconventional oil and gas resources, mainly the Montney, the Duvernay and the Deep Basin. And that oil production is privately owned by Canadian companies such as Suncor, Cenovus, Canadian Natural Resources, because all the oil majors have exited. Canada consumes 1.7 million barrels of oil per day and refines 1.9 million barrels per day at 17 refineries, most of which are in Alberta and Ontario. And on screen we can also below us see those refineries. So net, Canada exports 4.2 million barrels per day, mainly to the United States and Asia. Let's visit the oil pipelines of Canada, Athabasca, an Edmonton upgrader, the Burnaby Oil Export Terminal, and the Irving Refinery. Canada has over 30,000 kilometers of active oil pipelines. In below us we see in purple the Enbridge mainline that delivers about 70% of Canadian crude from the western part of the country to eastern parts of Canada and also the United States. In green, the Keystone Pipeline into the US that transports diluted bitumen, dilbit, and synthetic crude, operated by TC Energy. And in red, the Trans Mountain Pipeline to Vancouver, operated by the Trans Mountain Corporation. All the major pipelines are running near maximum capacity. Canada rails oil as well and exports to the US, motivating, as Mary said, in the trade war, an impetus to explore other export market access. Several expansion proposals for existing pipelines via looping, additional pumps, drag reducing agents are under evaluation or in open seasons. These may add 300 to 500,000 barrels per day of additional export capacity by 2030. Both Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre have proposed creating energy corridors to fast-track resource projects, though the plan still lacks specific details on implementation, and importantly, no new oil pipelines were on the first list of fast-track projects by Prime Minister Carney. These proposals face requiring defining what a corridor is, addressing regulatory complexities for different types of infrastructure, and getting buy-in from Indigenous groups and local communities. Canada, and specifically Alberta, has oil reserves the fourth largest globally after Venezuela, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Below us we see the Athabasca oil sands built around Fort McKay and Fort McMurray. That mining process, and yes, it's a mining process, entails removing forests and topsoil, mining the oil with trucks from a mine, stripping the oil from the oil sands using steam and gravity or chemicals, and depositing the tailings in a dam. Eventually the areas will be restored. The future of the tailing dams remains a challenge. And the bitumen which is produced this way can be diluted before export or upgraded at the mine or in Edmonton before it's refined. And it is truly valued by US refineries as feedstock. Speaking of upgrading, here we see the Suncor upgrader in Alberta that upgrades 350,000 barrels of heavy oil per day. A hydrogenation process adds hydrogen to the bitumen to improve its quality. The coking process separates bitumen into lighter and heavier fractions, and hydrocracking then breaks down heavy hydrocarbons into lighter ones. And the energy and carbon intensity of this processing links to what we shall later see as part of the grand bargain for carbon capture and storage in Canada. For the past decades, Canada really had only one export market for its oil, the United States. But the expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline from Edmonton in Alberta to Burnaby in British Columbia now gives 890,000 barrels of Canadian oil access to Pacific markets, as Mary noted in her headlines, and better pricing rather than traded at landlocked discounts. 80% of the Trans Mountain capacity is under long-term contracts, and the other 20% spot capacity has been largely unused to date. And below us we see the Burnaby Oil Export Terminal with its crude tanker loading facilities and oil spill barriers. And Mary, I know you often take account of the tankers loading and awaiting loading in your paddle board breaks. On the east coast of Canada, the Irving Oil Refinery is located in St. John, New Brunswick. It is currently the largest oil refinery in Canada, capable of producing more than 320,000 barrels of refined products per day. It mainly processes imported crude from Saudi Arabia, West Africa and the United States, plus smaller volumes from Western Canada that comes in by rail, and also some of the Atlantic offshore fields. So let's use that, Mary, to look at the Canadian energy trade.
As mentioned, Canada is endowed with energy resources. In fact, energy makes up over 10% of GDP and positions Canada as a net exporter, second only to the US among G7 countries. With nearly 90% of those exports currently flowing south to the US and amid the heightened sense of US trade vulnerability, diversifying our energy beyond a single market is becoming critical to Canada's economic resilience and future growth. Now, we visit hydro, which has been one of our significant energy resources, endowment, and energy export engines. Hydro usurps all other sources of power in supplying 54% of Canada's electricity and propelling Canada as a leader in hydropower, in turn contributing 22% of primary energy. In the headlines, we see Rio Tinto's modernization of century-old infrastructure in Quebec and the full commissioning of BC Hydro's Site C dam, which highlight a push to expand and upgrade hydro capacity. We also see the landmark Quebec, Newfoundland, and Labrador deal, which seeks to unlock vast untapped hydro potential and revenue sharing, signaling a renewed interprovincial collaboration. Yet, we also see climate volatility poses a growing challenge as droughts force Canada to import US electricity. And not featured in the headlines is the long and onerous permitting, propensity for delays, and cost overruns that have plagued recent hydro development. So, Andy, let's see hydro in Canada.
Canada is the world's fifth largest producer of hydropower, with a capacity of 83 gigawatts at 132 major plants. And below us, we see from east to west the largest Canadian rivers for hydropower, the Churchill, the La Grande, the St. Lawrence, the Columbia, and the Peace rivers. And we also see the names of the largest hydropower plants in the country. 6 provinces and territories such as British Columbia, Manitoba, Newfoundland, Labrador, Quebec, and the Yukon produce over 90% of their electricity from hydro. All the dams with large reservoirs were completed before 1990, and since then most development has been run-of-river, both large and small. Canadian First Nations generally take a very critical view of existing and more so new hydropower. So in Canada today, recent efforts have focused on more sustainable development and engaging and creating benefit agreements with First Nations, which has been key to the Quebec deal that Mary mentioned. Let's visit 3 places: Robert Bourassa, Site C, and Churchill Falls. We start in the eastern part of Canada at the Robert Bourassa, which is a hydropower station on the La Grande River that is part of the Hydro-Quebec James Bay project, owned and operated by Hydro-Quebec. The station that we see below us is Canada's largest hydropower station, and it can generate 5,600 megawatts at its 16 units. And at 137 meters underground, it is the world's largest underground power station. And the project's 53-story dam was constructed in James Bay, and its iconic spillway channels water down 10 gigantic concrete steps, each the size of 2 football fields. And this design, nicknamed the Giant Staircase, slows the water and prevents erosion. Next, we travel to the west of Canada, and below us we see the Site C hydropower project on the Peace River in British Columbia. It is the 3rd dam and the hydropower station on the Peace River after Peace Canyon Dam and the Peace River Generating Station, and it is now fully commissioned to generate 1,100 megawatts of electricity. Construction on the dam began in 2015. The dam has been quite controversial, with rising costs and delayed schedules, and with some environmental groups and First Nations opposing the project for its flooding and disruption of fish migration. Elsewhere in Canada, both Ontario and Quebec have plans to refurbish and expand their hydropower, as we will see. The Churchill Falls hydro plant in Labrador has a capacity of 5,428 megawatts, owned primarily by Nalcor Energy and partially by Hydro-Quebec. And below us we can see the water inlet, the water outlet, and all the transmission facilities. And ambitious expansion plans under the Quebec deal that Mary mentioned in the headlines includes building a second powerhouse to add a further 1,100 megawatts, aiming for completion by 2035, alongside the Gull Island project. Canada's hydropower supports much of the country's aluminium industry, where many smelters in Quebec and British Columbia are electrically or commercially connected to hydro plants so as to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of the aluminium produced for international markets. And below us we see the potlines of the Alouette aluminum smelter in Quebec. Canada hosts 9 aluminium smelters, 8 in Quebec and 1 in BC, owned mainly by Rio Tinto, Alcan and Alcoa, producing 3.3 million tons of aluminium, or 5% of the global aluminium market share.
From hydro as the dominant electricity source in Canada, let's explore coal, which currently provides only 4% of electricity and 2% of energy. And the headlines speak to this low level of use in Canada, driven by phase-out programs in Alberta and Ontario that contributed 80% of the GHG cut in the emissions curve bend we saw earlier. Yet amid a what comes next, conflicted and regionally varied stance on future coal use and exports, arising from tension between climate commitments and economic interests to tap into Western coal resources, and motivating Alberta to press for modernized policies and Saskatchewan for mine expansions to export thermal coal and delay the federal 2030 coal phase-out deadline. So Andy, let's see these headlines on the ground in the production and use of coal and visit one of the 3 coal-fired plants that are the target of Saskatchewan's legal challenge by environmental groups.
Below us we see the largest coal mines in Alberta, British Columbia and Saskatchewan. Canada produces 47 million tons of coal annually. This is actually quite small. Canada ranks 14th in the world and produces 1/100th of the coal produced in China. 36 million tons are metallurgical coal for steel making. 34 million tons are exported annually, mainly to Asian countries. And the thermal coal production is declining as the country phases out coal power by 2030. Let's visit 2 coal mines, Estevan and Fording. Here in Saskatchewan, we visit the Estevan coal mine on the left and the Shand power station on the right. Estevan supplies 8 million tons of lignite to nearby Saskatchewan power stations. The mine uses a truck and shovel method for coal extraction. It's operated by Westmoreland Mining and includes the Boundary Dam and Shand dedicated supply pits. And the annual output supports electricity generation for all the regional power demand. The Shand power plant on the right is a single unit lignite fired plant producing 276 megawatts. And as Mary mentioned, one of the few remaining coal fired power plants in Canada, including carbon capture readiness for future retrofits. It provides baseload power for the Saskatchewan electrical grid. The Fording River coal mine in British Columbia produces 8 million tons of coal per year and is the largest in Canada. It's owned by Glencore and it specializes in metallurgical steel coal. It exports mainly to Asian markets through several terminals in British Columbia, as we will see in a moment, and it is all shipped there by rail to those ports. The Trigon Pacific Terminal in Prince Rupert is owned by the Canadian federal government, and below us we can see the railway line bringing in coal, the coal stockpile, and a bulk carrier busy loading coal. It handles 12 million tons of coal annually and exports thermal and metallurgical coal primarily to Asian markets.
After seeing Canada's relatively low use of coal in electricity generation, let's take a side trip to electricity generation by source. And here, Canada's vastness, natural endowment, and varied geography shape our energy landscape and generation by source, with world-class hydro dominating at 54%, followed by growing gas generation at 17%, replacing coal, now reduced to 4% of the mix, with Ontario leading in nuclear generation, leveraging Canada's rich uranium reserves and contributing 13%. While our northern hemisphere location limits solar intensity, wind is growing in contribution now at 7%, with more potential along expansive coastlines and open prairie regions. Rounding out the mix is bioenergy at 2%, and coal and solar each contributing 1% respectively. Endowed with a reputation for reliable and relatively low-cost power and cooler climate, Canada is poised and is actively positioning in policy action to expand on the 239 operational data centers nationwide to support hyperscale and AI deployment. Here, in our side trip to current data center infrastructure in Canada, we see Ontario leads with 105 centers, followed by Quebec and Alberta. Total capacity is around 750 megawatts in 2024, with increased demand and where Quebec dominates.
Below us we see the data center, switchyard and transmission lines for Qscale's Q1 campus in Lévis, Quebec. It has an electrical load of 110 megawatts and is powered by 100% renewable hydropower. And Q1 is designed to capture roughly 100 megawatts waste heat and use it to heat over 15,000 households. Quite efficient.
Next on our tour is nuclear, providing 5% of primary energy and 13% of electricity for Canada. In the headlines, we see aspiration and tracks to refurbish and extend domestic capacity in nation-building projects, as well as in international markets with uranium feedstock and new technology beyond the CANDU market already captured. Leveraging the world's highest grade uranium deposit currently supplying 15% of global production, Canada aims to become the world's largest uranium producer as demand soars. In technology and innovation, the headlines speak to small reactor leadership and now targeting the first operational SMR in a G7 country, and building into Darlington a proprietary system for medical isotope production without interrupting electricity generation. So Andy, let's tour Canada's nuclear landscape.
Canada has 5 nuclear power plants in 3 provinces delivering 13 gigawatts of capacity, with Ontario and New Brunswick accounting for nearly all current output. Pickering and Darlington is operated by Ontario Power Generation, Bruce by TC and Borealis Infrastructure. Gently, Hydro-Quebec is being decommissioned, and Pointe-le-Preau is owned and operated by New Brunswick Power. All these power plants use Canadian CANDU pressurized water reactors, as Mary described in her headlines. And let's today visit 2 of those, Bruce and Darlington. The Bruce Nuclear Generating Station sits on the shores of Lake Huron in Bruce County, Ontario. And the 6,400 megawatts of electricity generation supplied by 8 operational reactors makes it the largest nuclear plant currently operating in the world. Bruce A, that we see below us, is the oldest, commissioned between 1977 and 79, making it about 47 years old. And the Bruce B reactors are slightly younger, coming online between 1984 and 1987, about 40 years old, and life extension of 35 years at each of these stations is now underway. The Darlington Nuclear Generating Station is located on the north shore of Lake Ontario. 4 CANDU nuclear reactors that we can see below us, with a total output of 3,512 megawatts. And as you described in the headlines, Mary, Canada's Small Modular Reactor Action Plan is Canada's plan for the development, demonstration, deployment of SMRs for multiple applications at home and abroad. And Ontario Power Generation has selected their BWRX 300 small modular reactor for the Darlington new nuclear site that we can see on the left. And they will work with GE Hitachi Nuclear Energy to deploy the reactor. Ontario Power Generation began construction on the first SMR after securing regulatory and provincial approvals in the spring of this year. It is also worth visiting the world's largest high-grade uranium mine located in Saskatchewan. MacArthur River is jointly owned by Cameco and LNG Canada, and the mine is entirely underground using freeze-wall technology to stabilize water-saturated rock. Production was suspended in 2018. It again resumed in 2022 with an annual capacity of 6,900 tons of uranium oxide. And it supports the global nuclear energy and boosts Canada's uranium leadership. Now, with nuclear done, Mary, let's turn to natural gas.
Next, we tour Canada's gas and LNG landscape, where gas has grown in contribution to provide 34% of primary energy and 17% of electricity, and now in LNG exports. In the headlines is Canada's first LNG export cargo from the Pacific Coast, marking a historic pivot away from US-centric energy trade and opening up direct access to the Asian markets via Kitimat, BC. An outcome of Andy's pivotal role as LNG Canada's CEO, achieving FID and for successors to complete construction and operating. LNG exports are part of a broader ambition now articulated by Prime Minister Carney to transform Canada into a global energy superpower, leveraging abundant natural gas and clean electricity, and adding LNG Canada's expansion to major projects for fast tracking. Also in the news is Alberta positioning to benefit with natural gas prices expected to jump due to LNG exports, and simultaneously pursuing a $100 billion vision to become North America's premier hub for AI data centers, capitalizing on its abundant natural gas for powering these facilities. So Andy, let's see gas and these tracks on the ground.
Let's first look at the Canadian gas reserves and gas transmission system. Canada produces natural gas mainly in Alberta and British Columbia, with significant shale gas from the Montney, the Duvernay and the Horn River formations, all part of the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. Proven gas reserves exceed 70 TCF, and Canada produces 17 billion cubic feet daily, of which Alberta supplies 65% and British Columbia 35%. A very extensive pipeline network spans the country, and we can see the Nova gas transmission system in golden color, which gathers Alberta and British Columbia supplies, the Trans-Canada Mainline in red, which connects Western production to Eastern markets. The domestic consumption is 9 BCF daily, and in blue, the Alliance Pipeline, which transports gas to the United States. Canada exports 7 billion cubic feet daily to the USA. A quarter of Canadian gas consumption is in gas-fired power plants. And below us we see the 39 gas-fired power plants at each of the pink markers, with a total capacity of 22 gigawatts. It's quite clear that Ontario and Alberta host the most of these gas-fired power generating stations, and natural gas is increasingly replacing coal and supports grid stability at the same time. Canada's 2035 net zero electricity target, which is pushed by the Clean Electricity Regulations, aims to severely restrict gas power unless carbon capture and storage has been added, which is both expensive and technically complex, and gas plants must meet performance thresholds which very few plants can meet. Peaker plants are capped at 450 operating hours per year, making them financially unviable under these draft rules. Let's visit one of those plants, the Lennox plant in the eastern part of the country. The Lennox gas-fired power plant is owned by Ontario Power Generation, and below us we can see the generators, the electrical substation and the oil tanks for a dual fuel natural gas and oil plant which can generate 2,100 megawatts. It mainly operates as a peaking plant. The most talked about gas topic in Canada currently is the export of gas to Asia in the form of LNG. Canada has had an ambivalent relationship with LNG, and it is the country in the world with the highest ratio of planned to actual LNG plants. LNG Canada and Cedar and Woodfibre have taken FID, and LNG Canada is now exporting LNG, and time will tell if more plants will be built. CO2 price, First Nations and BC CO2 limits with legislated reductions all stand in the way of expansion. But US growth has certainly shaken up BC and Canada, and so let's visit two LNG plants, LNG Canada up in Kitimat and Woodfibre in Squamish. LNG Canada is a joint venture between Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi and KOGAS, located in Kitimat, British Columbia, and supplied by the Coastal GasLink pipeline at its inlet. It started LNG exports in July with an initial capacity of 14 million tons per year, and below us we can see the modules of the LNG plant. I certainly hope that the plans will come to fruition for phase 2 expansion, which will double the capacity to 28 million tons per year, and was personally delighted when the federal government announced its support for expansion last week. Down the coast of British Columbia is Woodfibre LNG, to be powered by British Columbia's hydropower. It is located in Squamish on a former pulp mill site, and it's the first industrial project with Indigenous government as its regulator. It is expected to produce 2.1 million tons of LNG per year, owned by Pacific Energy Corporation and Enbridge, and it is still under construction, as we can see below, with production expected to start in 2027.
Canada is somewhat of a nascent wind energy environment, with wind providing 3% of primary energy currently and 7% of electricity. The news headlines speak to Canada's world-class wind potential, especially offshore, still lagging relative to global leaders in terms of deployment and infrastructure. Recent policy momentum and regional and international partnerships featured in the headlines suggest a turning point, if execution follows. In visiting our wind landscape and wind resource potential, Canada is endowed with strongest winds in the coastal regions and prairie provinces, as indicated by the Canadian Wind Atlas. Northern territories also show good wind resource, but all remain very remote. And this remoteness raises costs and lags in needed transmission infrastructure, despite abundant available wind resource. So Andy, let's see more of Canada's wind landscape.
Canada has 15 gigawatts of installed onshore wind capacity at 245 wind farms, which can be seen as green and red dots below us. The green ones are in operation, the red ones under construction. Ontario, Quebec and Alberta lead in installed wind capacity. Alberta specifically imposed a moratorium in August 2023, pausing the approval for new wind and solar projects. And although the moratorium was lifted in February 2024, it's been replaced with strict land use rules and scenic buffer restrictions. And the outcome is that 53 projects were cancelled, 8 gigawatts was lost, investor confidence weakened, and renewable growth was stalled. Now, as Mary showed, offshore wind potential remains largely untapped but highly promising, especially along the Atlantic coast. Several provinces are studying or permitting offshore projects, but none have reached construction or operation yet. And that lack of progress is due to cost, due to permitting complexity and transmission challenges in the remote coastal areas. Let's visit two wind farms, Seigneurie du Beaupré wind farm in Quebec and the Buffalo Plains wind farm in Alberta. Below us we see the Seigneurie du Beaupré wind farm located in Quebec's Côte de Beaupré region. It was installed with a capacity of 364 megawatts, jointly owned by Bourassa and Energia, and comprises multiple phases and turbines, and provides renewable energy into the Hydro-Quebec grid. Our second visit is to the Buffalo Plains wind farm located in southern Alberta. It has a planned total capacity of 495 megawatts, which will make it the largest in Canada. It's been developed and owned by ABO Wind, and completion is scheduled for later in 2025. No large wind turbine nacelles, the combination of the gearbox and generator, are manufactured in Canada, but the Gaspé facility in Quebec, which we see below us, manufactures composite wind turbine blades. These blades range from 60 to 100 meters long. They supply the Vineyard Wind offshore project, which is currently experiencing some blade failures, but those failures have raised quality control questions at Gaspé. However, production continues supplying global onshore and offshore projects.
In visiting the wind landscape, we noted a limitation in transmission connection. In this side visit, let's see Canada's transmission grid, which spans over 160,000 kilometers nationally and takes remote regional energy to demand sources. The provinces operate these predominantly north-south independent grids, interconnected through high voltage lines with some interties across the country, but no real cross-country capacity. Hydro-Quebec manages the largest transmission network in North America, and a number of provinces have interties to the US. Along the more significant after Quebec are Ontario, Manitoba, and BC, which enable electricity trade with US Western, Midwest, and Central markets. Significant upgrades are needed for renewable integration and future electrification growth, which are, as noted in the previous wind potential map, is on the northern coast and the unpopulated prairies. From a relatively negligible solar contribution of 1% of primary energy and electricity, the headlines speak to Canada's solar sector gaining ground. This is despite a relative nascent market and modest solar resources, except in Alberta, the prairies, and southern Ontario, where solid tracks are being made. The headlines speak of recent growth from expanded urban solar rebates for multi-unit residential properties and deployment of large solar rooftops installations, and breaking ground on Indigenous-led solar grid developments. However, underlying the headlines on new solar project rules in Alberta is the consequences of its 2023 moratorium to address land use, competing use, and other stakeholders' concerns, which have acted to cloud the landscape for new solar development pending the new rules. As mentioned, southern Alberta and Saskatchewan are the sunniest locations in Canada. In mapping Canada's solar resources, the endowment is in southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan, and this is where the highest solar potential is, and to a modest extent, there's solar in eastern Canada. However, none is as strong as the US Southwest and other premium solar landscapes. So Andy, let's see solar on the ground in Canada.
Canada has over 4 gigawatts of installed solar capacity at 238 solar farms, which we can see as green dots. And it's quite clear that they are located as far south as possible to improve their power output. Ontario and Alberta host most of the solar farms and rooftop installations nationwide. Let's visit 4 of those. Travers, Edmonton Rooftop, Kingston, and Nanticoke. The Travers Solar Farm is located in southern Alberta. It is Canada's largest solar project with 465 megawatts. Was completed in 2022, owned by Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. And below us we can see the 1.3 million photovoltaic solar panels which provide clean energy into the Alberta grid. Canada's largest rooftop solar installation is located atop Edmonton's Expo Centre. It generates 3 megawatts of electricity to operate the Expo Centre, and below us we can see the 5,000 photovoltaic solar panels. Travelling to Kingston in Ontario, we can see multiple solar farms in the countryside below us. And this development is driven by flat, open farmland, reasonable solar irradiance, transmission access, and the Ontario feed-in tariff. And our last visit, whilst we're in Ontario, is to the Nanticoke Solar Farm. It's been built on a former coal plant site. It generates 44 megawatts of power. It's jointly owned by Ontario Power Generation and uses 192,000 solar panels that we can clearly see. So, Mary, having now looked at both wind and solar power, let's turn to electricity storage.
For Canadian pumped and battery storage from a very low installed base, there is some momentum as evidenced in the headlines. And these headlines feature record-scale projects in both pumped hydro and battery technologies in Ontario's plan for the country's biggest pumped storage hydro plant to provide long-duration grid balancing infrastructure, while the early and below-budget delivery of Ontario's 1 gigawatt-hour battery project shows growing domestic capability and cost efficiency in short-duration storage. This dual-track development, pump storage for seasonal and multi-day balancing, and batteries for rapid response short-term stabilization, is needed and needs to accelerate. As the headlines speak to activity kicking into gear and power developers turning more to battery storage strategies to better integrate variable renewables, enhance grid resilience, and reduce reliance on fossil peakers.
Canada today has extremely limited electricity grid storage, with only one pump storage in the Sir Adam Beck plant and one battery electricity storage at Oneida. The other 9 projects we see listed on the right are all very small. Let's visit 3 places: the Adam Beck pump storage plant, Oneida battery storage, and the planned Ontario pump storage. The Sir Adam Beck pump storage near Niagara Falls is Canada's only pump storage hydro, as I said a moment ago. And below us we can see the Niagara River, the 2 storage reservoirs at Queenstown and Chippewa, into which water is pumped from the generating and pumping station during periods of low demand. The storage capacity of the 2 reservoirs is far greater than all the existing battery storage in the country. As Mary headlined, the Oneida battery storage is located in Ontario, and below us we can see the 278 Tesla battery packs. It has a capacity of 250 megawatts and 1,000 megawatt hours of storage, making it the largest in Canada, and is an interesting partnership between NR Store and Six Nations. And it stabilizes the Ontario grid with its growing renewable electricity. Very significantly, TC Energy plans a 1,000 megawatt pump storage plant with 8,000 megawatt hours of storage near Meaford in Ontario. And as we can see below us, it will use the Georgian Bay on the left as lower reservoir and a upper reservoir elevated to shift electricity demand. and TC Energy and Sajin Ojibwe Nation are advancing the project. Ontario is funding $285 million, and geotechnical studies are planned for this year for a number of significant design decisions that still need to be taken.
As we wrap our tour, we look to carbon capture. Here the headlines speak to a nascent yet pivotal carbon capture landscape in Canada's carbon capture systems, both through traditional CCS and innovative methods, as central to reconciling energy exports with net zero objectives in the Grand Bargain, featured earlier in the headlines on oil. Now, newly announced political backing, streamlined regulations, speeded up permitting, and resetting of industry relations in the oil industry attempt to ramp up NCCS development as the Pathways Project. In particular, the Pathways Project is touted to create efficient scale and capture for emissions inherent in upstream and downstream refining in facilities like we toured of Suncor's Upgrader. Also in the headlines is startups offering scalable, low-impact climate solutions. However, underlying these headlines, and despite the federal government's commitment to pathways and streamlined regulation, are the challenges of funding uncertainties, complex regulation, and cost volatility, remaining critical roadblocks to CCS deployment at scale.
Below us we see the 23 carbon capture centres and pilot projects across Canada, but we can also see the 5 operational commercial scale projects capturing about 4 million tonnes of CO2 per year, which can be compared with the 700 million tonnes of annual Canadian emissions. And it is clear that this effort is led by the 2 leading oil and gas producing provinces of Alberta and British Columbia. Specifically, Alberta has pre-combustion technology, which is well tested, and subsurface formation integrity, which is well understood. And in Alberta, given the extensive drilling with thousands of well bores and geological modelling, there's a great experience base. Let's visit 3 projects: Quest, Carbon Trunk Line, and the Deep Sky Alpha project. Located near Edmonton in Alberta and operated by Shell, Quest captures over 1 million tonnes of CO2 annually and stores that CO2 permanently in deep saline aquifers. And it's been the largest Canadian carbon capture and storage project, and also the first one to do so, providing critical experience for future decarbonisation technologies in the country. The Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, which we can see on the diagram on the right, is the world's largest CO2 pipeline network. It collects captured emissions from multiple industrial facilities and has the capacity to transport 14 million tonnes annually, currently doing 1 to 2 million tonnes per year. And it delivers that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery and storage, and it's an absolutely key infrastructure supporting Canada's carbon reduction goals. Deep Sky Alpha is a CCS project operating in Alberta. The facility began operations in August this year, capturing 3,000 tonnes of CO2 from ambient air. It is solar powered, and we can see that it tests multiple direct air capture systems operating side by side and permanently sequesters the captured CO2 also in a deep saline aquifer underground.
Our final visit is to hydrogen. Here, recent news articles indicate that Canada's hydrogen sector is moving from vision to deployment, with significant public investments such as HTEC's $472 million liquefier facility in BC and export-focused partnerships between Canada and Germany. As well, we see 2025 targets for Air Products network of hydrogen refueling stations for heavy-duty trucks and Everwind's green hydrogen and ammonia plant startup, beginning to position Canada in clean hydrogen production, domestic use, and exports. However, the path is still nascent as projects hinge on sustained government subsidies, long-term offtake agreements, and the resolution of technological hurdles in storage, transport, and end-use applications, and now in supply chain tariff issues in sourcing electrolyzers from the US. Andy, let's see the state of hydrogen in Canada's landscape.
The federal government in Canada launched the Hydrogen Strategy for Canada, positioning hydrogen as a crucial enabler for net zero emissions by 2050 back in December 2020. And it focused on leveraging Canada's capabilities in both green hydrogen from renewables and blue hydrogen from natural gas with carbon capture, utilization and storage. And that strategy covered end-use applications, production facilities and hubs. That strategy is now dated and not delivered on. Today there are 13 low carbon hydrogen production facilities operating across 6 Canadian provinces, but they mainly produce blue hydrogen. Over 80 projects have been announced, but most still in the development phase for mostly green hydrogen. The federal government committed investments for clean hydrogen tax credits and pilot funding, and an export MOU was signed with Germany, but pilot exports have not yet started. Codes and standards have been updated to enable hydrogen blending into natural gas networks. Let's visit 2 facilities, one operating at Bécancour and one planned at New John Cornick. Air Liquide's green hydrogen plant is located in Bécancour in Quebec, powered by hydroelectricity. And below us we can see the electrolyzer building and the hydrogen storage tanks. And this is the largest green hydrogen plant currently operating in Canada. It uses American Cummins electrolyzers to produce 8 tons daily and supplies that hydrogen for industry and zero emissions transportation. Mary headlined the ambition to export green hydrogen to Germany, and World Energy's GH2 project at New Cornick has secured approval for 2 600 megawatt phases. The project will draw on 2 gigawatts of onshore wind production, and on the left you can see the proposed wind farms, and on the right the electrolyzers and ammonia synthesis loops and tanks. If it goes ahead, it will be Canada's first commercial green hydrogen ammonia export project in Newfoundland and Labrador, and the planned output will reach 400,000 tons of green hydrogen per year, and the export markets will target Europe with shipments beginning in the late 2020s. Time will tell. Before we end our tour today, let's make an unscheduled stop in Saskatchewan. A privately held corporation is leading way on renewable geothermal development by introducing renewable baseload power generation to the Saskatchewan power grid. And after more than a decade of preliminary work and preparatory engineering, Deep Earth Energy is positioned to be the first large-scale producer of geothermal power in Canada. And below us we can see the test well, and the injection and production wells are 3.5 kilometers deep. And deep as the geothermal rights in 39,000 hectares for at least 200 megawatts of geothermal power.
In concluding, we revisit our current view of Canada's energy trilemma and invite ongoing inputs from you on the shape for 2030 and beyond. Thank you.